Sorry about that. Hello, yeah. So, Paul Greene-Dennis here, and welcome back once again as an update. I am back. Been doing a couple of things, performing and whatnot, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. Another update, I actually decided for my political education to join the Center for Political Innovation, which is Caleb Maupin's organization that he founded, and I felt it was in my best interest to do so. And I preface that by saying this. I asked him, because I know he did a series of audiobooks he recorded on his end, if he needed somebody else to record a few books of his with his permission, and he said sure. And for today, I'm just going to do a straight read of one of his books. What is Innovationism? A basic introduction to the Center for Political Innovation. So this is Caleb Maupin's What is Innovationism? A basic introduction to the Center for Political Innovation. If you want to see, no, it probably doesn't look right because it's mirrored, but yeah. And with that, I'm going to just do a straight read of this book to help him out with his audiobooks. What is innovationism? Here we go. What separates human beings from animals? What is unique about human beings? The creation story of most religions points to something unique about humanity. The ancient Greeks spoke of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods of Mount Olympus and passed it on to human beings. The Abrahamic faiths tell of Adam and Eve in a garden, eating forbidden fruit that they are warned will give them the knowledge of good and evil. The truth is that humanity possesses a spark of divinity, a creative ability that animals do not have. In his essay, The Role Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man, Friedrich Engels observes, in short, the animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by its presence. Man, by his changes, makes it serve his ends, masters it. This is the final, essential distinction between man and other animals, and once again, it is labor that brings about this distinction. The first book of the Old Testament of the Christian Bible says, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Human beings are creative. Human beings have the ability to change the world around them, to force the environment to serve them. This is called creativity. It is a spark of divinity. Religions generally define God as the creator, but one can hold any set of beliefs and understand that creativity is a unique and extraordinary power. Human beings, unlike other species, thus have a divine aspect to them. Human beings are creative. The way we human beings interact with our environment is constantly being reinvented. Ants have been making their ant farms the same way for thousands of years. Beavers have been building the beaver dams the same way for thousands of years. Bees have been making beehives and farming their honey the same way for thousands of years. What makes humanity unlike any other species is that in just 7,000 to 8,000 years, we have radically altered our relationship with nature and reinvented the way we interact with our environment. While the natural world seems content to simply exist, human beings have a different tendency. We are striving to grow. As we have reinvented our relationship with nature, we have expanded our life expectancy, increased our population, and improved the comfort and quality of our lives. We have learned about the world around us in order to alter and change it to serve us better. The majority of human history was spent in hunter-gatherer civilizations, in which we lived in tribes of 20 to 30. We hunted animals for meat and gathered fruits, nuts, and vegetation. This was the way humans lived for the overwhelming majority of our existence as a species. But something happened. We got too good at hunting and gathering. We learned to develop spears and use rocks to kill animals more effectively. We learned to observe the patterns of plant life so we could consume the maximum amount of vegetation. As a result, our population increased, and there was a great deal of scarcity. Our productive abilities surpassed the limits of hunting and gathering. With our creativity and brilliance, we had exceeded the capabilities of the first mode of production, hunter-gatherer civilization. This then forced us to develop a new mode of production. We began growing crops and domesticating animals. Property was invented. The family emerged as an institution, and along with it came the state, a mechanism for enforcing property. Out of hunter-gatherer civilization, with the dawn of agriculture, emerged a new mode of production called slavery. Slavery brought us ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. Massive civilizations emerged based on this new mode of production, involving slave owners and slaves working the land to produce food and keeping herds of livestock. Out of slavery, a more efficient mode of production emerged called feudalism. In feudalism, instead of having slaves who have no real motivation to work except to avoid punishment, a serf or peasant has his own tract of land. He paid his rent and obligations to a land-owning noble or aristocrat and kept what was left over. Feudalism is a higher mode of production than slavery, just as slavery is a higher mode of production than hunter-gatherer civilization. In the 1400s in Europe, things began to change once again. Because of the Silk Road from Asia, new Asian inventions like the printing press and gunpowder being brought in, and the development of a mercantile class, we saw the very beginnings of a new mode of production. As the European countries began seizing parts of Africa, Asia, and the New World as colonies and bringing in huge amounts of wealth, this all laid the basis for a social explosion that happened in Europe. The French Revolution, the English Civil War, and the American War of Independence all marked the beginning of a new social order as feudalism was ripped apart. The new system of production, organized for profit, industrial capitalism, emerged to replace feudalism. Capitalism once again increased living standards, brought new technology, and increased the population and life expectancy. This process of constant reinvention of our relationship with nature, and in the process, creating new systems of social organization to correspond with it, very much defines humanity. Understanding these laws of human society and its trajectory can help us understand the problems we face today, as once again, our brilliant creative abilities have overcome the restrictions and limits of the way society is organized. What does the word capitalism mean to us? The word capitalism has many definitions in our time. People define capitalism as owning their own business or selling goods on the market. People define capitalism as spending money. People define capitalism as inequality. People define capitalism as the government stepping back and allowing people to innovate, or sometimes as a government that serves the very rich and ignores the needs of the poor. We live in an age defined by demagogy. The Oxford Language Dictionary defines demagogy as political activity or practices that seek support by appealing to the desires and prejudices of ordinary people rather than by using rational argument. The reason there are so many definitions of the word capitalism is that many demagogues who do not wish for you to think are trying to appeal to your feelings without teaching you anything in the process. Rather than helping you understand the process of history and the nature of humanity, demagogues say, "Aren't your taxes too high?" or "Isn't it unfair that rich people have more money?" etc. These false definitions of capitalism serve demagogues who want to give you a short, emotional message that can get them lots of attention on social media, win your sympathy quickly, etc. For our purposes here, we need to define capitalism correctly. When the Center for Political Innovation speaks about capitalism, we are speaking about a society where profits are in command. We are speaking about the anarchy of production. We are speaking about a situation where goods and services are delegated based on what is most profitable for those who own the centers of economic power. Money existed in feudalism, in slave empires, and in non-capitalist societies around the world. Private businesses and markets existed before capitalism as well, and they exist in societies where capitalism has been transcended. Likewise, there was plenty of inequality and poverty in slavery, feudalism, and other societies that do not have capitalism. Engels said, "For in capitalistic society, the means of production can only function when they have undergone a preliminary transformation into capital." The centers for economic power function to maximize profits for their owners. Out of the ruins of feudalism in Europe emerged capitalism, a society where profits are in command. Capitalism has gone through 4 distinct stages. First stage, primitive accumulation. Transitioning from feudalism to capitalism involved theft and murder on a scale humanity had never seen before. The feudal commons were turned into private estates. Peasants were thrown off their lands across Europe, and thousands of people were hanged for being vagabonds, the crime of being homeless. The Americas were seized from the native people. Africans were colonized, and the transatlantic slave trade was established, with millions killed in the Middle Passage, stolen from Africa and taken to the United States, the Caribbean, or South America. Acquiring enough wealth to lift European civilization from the Dark Ages to the modern world economy was a bloody process. Do not think for a moment that the richest of the rich, the billionaire monopolies that dominate the Western world, acquired their wealth through hard work. The process of primitive accumulation was hundreds of years of stealing and killing to set the stage for the modern world. Second stage, industrialization. Out of feudalism emerged a new economic system in which goods were produced in factories. There were factory owners, or capitalists, and there were wage workers who rented themselves out to make the products. The capitalists wanted to maximize their profits by paying as little as they could get away with. The factory workers wanted to get paid more for their labor power. Workers formed unions to go on strike and demand better pay and conditions from their employers. The labor movement emerged as a struggle between the working class, who sold their labor power, and the factory owners, who turned their labor power into profits. At the time, many workers felt they were exploited because they were not being paid the full value of their labor. Let's examine a factory that creates tires. The factory owner would need to acquire rubber and materials to create the tires. This is represented by A. The factory owner would also need to ship the tires, transporting them to where they are being sold. This is represented by B. Furthermore, he will need to hire workers to assemble the tires. This is represented by C. The final cost of the tires is then represented by D. A equals materials, B equals shipping, C equals labor power, and D equals the final cost. A plus B plus C equals D. What is missing? In order for the factory owner to get a return on his investment, he will need to make a profit. However, he cannot extract profit from the materials. To sell them at their value would result in a loss, as the shipping has already eaten into his investment. It follows that he cannot extract profit from the shipping. As stated, shipping is an expense. So, in order to profit, the employer must transform materials into his product, which takes labor. That labor adds value to the materials by making them into usable products, and the social contract of capitalism is that this value is split between the employer and the employee. This is wage and profit, the value of labor split between worker and owner. So the formula should really be this way: A plus B plus C1 plus C2 equals D. C1 equals wages paid out. C2 equals profits extracted by the employer. C1 represents what the workers get paid in wages. C2 represents the profit extracted by the employer. The labor movement largely felt that the employer-employee relationship was unfair because the capitalist was extracting from the labor power of the worker in order to get his profits. This concept is called surplus value. The value crisis. Employers will argue that they are entitled to this surplus value because they invested and put up the money for the enterprise. Strikes, protests, and all kinds of legislation have been created as workers and employers are constantly renegotiating the terms of how much they will be paid and how much the employer can take as profit. This is the basis of the labor movement. However, the industrial system led to a new problem beyond any perceived injustice. In the equation above, C1 can only ever be less than D. This is to say that wages paid out in the process of production are never enough to buy all the products produced. There is always more product created than there is purchasing power available to buy it. To put it another way, it is impossible to create consumer spending power at the rate of production if a fraction of it is always being removed. This leads to an economic problem that never existed before in the history of civilization. Economists generally call it glut. The market slows down and businesses crash because there are too many products. This is called a value crisis, or sometimes overproduction. Only in a system where profits are in command can people become homeless because there are too many houses, or hungry because there is too much food. Abundance leads to poverty, poverty amid plenty, poverty created by great wealth and massive production. This is a highly irrational problem, but it flows from the fact that profits and the rational market forces dictate production. This problem is constant right up to today. In Springfield, Missouri, there is a cave where the U.S. government has buried billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese. For decades, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has bought this cheese from farmers and buried it in order to prevent the farming sector of the United States from collapsing. Buying huge amounts of cheese and storing it keeps the price of dairy high. The U.S. government also spends billions and billions of dollars on weapons, purchasing all kinds of tanks, guns, drones, and military hardware. This keeps the economy going. The falling rate of profit. This problem is then exacerbated by another factor, technology. In order to maximize their profits, employers are constantly seeking to advance technology. They want to hire fewer workers. They want the workers they do hire to be easier to replace and require less training. With great technological advances, labor costs can be lowered. However, this presents yet another problem. Let's recall our formula. A plus B plus C1 plus C2 equals D. Reducing the amount of labor power from humans involved in production means decreasing the overall percentage of D, the final cost, that is derived from C, labor power. But as labor power decreases, the rate of profits also decreases because, again, the employer can only extract profit from labor power. As C decreases, C2 also decreases. The rate of profit per item goes down the more technology increases and the less labor power goes into production. As a result, the employer must then sell even more products because the amount of profit he is making on each one is lower. This compounds the problem of the value crisis over time. It grows to be a more and more serious problem, eventually leading to recessions or even depressions. Great technological leaps are thus followed by great economic downturns. This does not make any rational sense. If human beings' ability to produce goods becomes more efficient, we should see a rise in wealth. However, because our survival is reliant on our ability to sell our labor power to an employer, technological leaps lead to greater poverty. Why should self-driving cars be a bad thing? Wouldn't it be great if this chore called driving could be overcome? It should be a great thing. But in our system, it would mean millions of Uber drivers, truck drivers, state highway patrolmen, traffic court employees, etc. would be unemployed. The incredible innovation of self-driving cars becomes more reliable and thus more practical with time, but it could potentially mean riots in the streets and massive poverty, with millions out of work as their labor power is no longer needed. This is not rational. The third stage, globalism/imperialism. All of this leads to a situation where corporations and industries are constantly seeking out new markets to buy their products. A famous British capitalist named Cecil Rhodes explained what he thought the solution was after watching a protest of unemployed workers in London. Rhodes said, "I was in the East End of London, a working class quarter, yesterday, and attended a meeting of the unemployed. I listened to the wild speeches, which were just a cry for bread. And on my way home, I pondered over the scene and I became more than ever convinced of the importance of imperialism. My cherished idea is a solution for the social problem, i.e., in order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new lands to settle the surplus population, to provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and mines. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialists." Cecil Rhodes put his vision into practice by seizing a huge amount of land in Africa and making it the captive market of the British capitalists. Before it won its independence, Zimbabwe was called Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. In the years following the American Revolution, Henry Charles Carey, a U.S. economist who advised Abraham Lincoln, wrote the following words: "Two systems are before the world. One looks to exporting men to occupy desert tracts, the sovereignty of which is obtained by aid of diplomacy or war. The other, to increasing the value of an immense extent of vacant land by importing men by millions for their occupation. One looks to the concentration of wealth and power in a great commercial city that shall rival the great cities of modern times, which have been and are being supported by aid of contributions that have exhausted every nation subjected to them. The other by concentration, by aid of which a market shall be made upon the land for the products of the land, and the farmer and planter are enriched. One looks to increasing the necessity for commerce. The other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks to underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level. The other to raising the standard of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks toward universal war, the other toward universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which that was of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. Such is the true mission of the people of these United States." He was observing that Britain's economy was shifting from merely industrial capitalism and moving into a new stage that was eventually called imperialism. Bankers became dominant over industrialists. A banker and industrialist both seek to maximize profits, but there's a fundamental difference. An industrialist ideally wants wealth in society to increase because more people will buy his products, whether he understands the value of crisis or the issue of value crisis or not. However, a banker makes money through lending money, and the poorer society gets, the more people will be in debt to him. Every major religion in history has forbidden the lending of money at interests, or usury. Usury is a process through which money is created without any real value being added. Money is created for money. The more usury and speculation in the economy, the less living standards and prosperity can increase. Wealth and value come from the physical economy, not from speculation or fictitious capital. This system of globalism/imperialism is distinct from the era of industrial capitalism. In globalism and imperialism, bankers rule rather than factory owners. An international financial oligarchy exists, seizing chunks of the world with territorial partition. The government is heavily involved in managing the big banks and the stock market to make sure the big monopolies can dominate the world. War and poverty. As bankers came to dominate the global economy, they seized sections of the world and impoverished them. The people of India had been weaving on looms for thousands of years. When the British seized India, they burned the looms and forced the people of India to import their cloth from British factories. Likewise, the people of Mexico had been growing their own food long before Christopher Columbus arrived. However, if you go to Mexico today, almost all the food in the country comes from agribusiness corporations based in the United States. Mexico's farming sector was crushed by NAFTA, and as a result, foreign corporations dominate the market. Nigeria produces more wealth than any other country in Africa. The Niger Delta region is rich with oil, the most valuable commodity in our world economy. However, the people of Nigeria live in great poverty because the profits from their oil go into the pockets of BP, Shell, Chevron, and ExxonMobil, corporations based in the United States and Britain. Imperialism is about holding back development, keeping countries impoverished, and serving as captive markets. It is about maintaining a monopoly for corporations based in the United States, Britain, France, and the former colonial powers. Imperialism is a system, a global economic setup where Wall Street and London bankers keep themselves rich by making the world poor. The main way that imperialism is enforced is through war. If a country breaks free from imperialism and takes control of its own economy, it must be beaten down and destroyed. Iraq had broken free from imperialism and taken control of its own oil, so the United States invaded, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and destroyed the country. Now its oil exports are a mere 10% of what they once were, and those who once bought oil from Iraq are now purchasing it from Western oil monopolies. Libya had also taken control of its oil and had the highest life expectancy in Africa. However, in 2011, the United States bombed and destroyed Libya, and now it is also impoverished and exporting a very small amount of oil. The countries that mainstream media tells us to hate and that the government is always threatening with sanctions and war are countries that have broken free from imperialism. The aristocracy of labor. It is important to point out that imperialism/globalism would never have been set up without socialists. During the 1890s and early 1900s, factory workers in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States went on strike demanding higher wages. In Britain, a Labour Party was formed. In Germany, the Social Democratic Party was formed. In France, many socialist groups emerged. In the United States, the American Federation of Labor, AFL, was created. Originally, these socialists and labor activists wanted to overthrow capitalism, but increasingly they started supporting their governments and their wars, simply wanting a bigger share of profits for the workers at home. While some workers remained in poverty, a layer of higher paid workers was created called the aristocracy of labor. The labor aristocrats who dominated the socialist groups and labor unions were key in rallying people to support the imperialist wars. They also enacted reforms like the 8-hour workday, workplace safety regulations, and minimum wages, which stabilized the Western countries so they could more effectively dominate the rest of the world. The reformist socialist leaders and labor union bureaucrats, along with the higher paid workers, the aristocracy of labor, were a necessary part of the imperialist system. World War I was the biggest war humanity had ever seen. When it started in 1914, it was called the War to End All Wars. It was a fight between the imperialist powers over who would get to run the world. The British, American, and French bankers were fighting the German, Austrian, and Turkish bankers, carving up the world among themselves. 20 million workers died in a war that involved aircraft bombing, widespread use of machine guns, and poison gas. The war would never have happened without the socialists. The socialists of various countries had pledged never to support a war, but they changed their minds. The Labour Party in Britain, the French socialists, and the German Social Democrats were all essential in rallying working people to go kill each other so the big bankers could divide up the world. Throughout the 20th century, there was a relative stability in the Western countries because the socialist groups oversaw the creation of a welfare state. A well-paid and comfortable aristocracy of labor was loyal to imperialism and assured peace at home in order to allow the developing world to be plundered. The fourth stage, destructive accumulation. When World War I broke out, one socialist in Germany refused to support it, while the German Social Democratic Party rallied workers to go and fight. Rosa Luxemburg spoke out against the war and was thrown in prison. At the time, she made this eerie prediction. This world war is a regression into barbarism. The triumph of imperialism leads to the annihilation of civilization. At first, this happens sporadically for the duration of a modern war, but then, when the period of unlimited wars begins, it progresses toward its inevitable consequences. The triumph of imperialism and the collapse of all civilization, as in ancient Rome, depopulation, desolation, degeneration, a great cemetery. While imperialism was rising, working people in the United States, Britain, France, and Germany were getting wealthier. The countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America were getting poorer, but the working people in the West got some of the loot, and society became more stable. However, Rosa Luxemburg knew about the problems of technology. She predicted that wars to seize new markets would become more and more necessary as the rate of profit decreased. Technology would lead to a situation where the rate of profits was going down. The role of workers at the assembly line would decrease, and in order to keep the economy rolling, war would become a constant necessity. Rosa Luxemburg was predicting the military-industrial complex and many of the developments that have happened in Western countries. She argued that the aristocracy of labor, the well-paid sections of working people in the Western countries, would be eroded. The Western homelands would get poorer and poorer as the government's focus spread across the planet, trying to enforce the globalist imperialism system with war. Eventually, the Western countries would deteriorate into barbarism, much as the Roman Empire had collapsed under its own weight from internal decay. Rosa Luxemburg's prediction is coming true as we are seeing the Western countries rot from within. Increasingly, the big corporations in the United States do not extract profits from creating real value, but rather through deconstruction. Take the opioid epidemic. It is now known that big pharma corporations pushed doctors to overprescribe opioid medications that they knew were addictive because they wanted to make more money. Did getting all kinds of working people addicted to narcotics create more wealth in society? No. It did the opposite. It reduced many healthy and able-bodied people who could be productive into drug addicts. The same can be said about the prison industrial complex. Prisons for profit emerged in the 1990s, with corporations pressuring the government to lock up more people so they can make money providing the service of imprisoning people. Did our society become more prosperous and was more value created by increasing the number of people locked up by millions? Of course not. This has had a very detrimental effect on the country overall. There are many, many examples of destructive accumulation. Right now, across America, bridges and roads are crumbling. The power grid in Texas and Los Angeles, among other places, is in decay. Water systems are not properly purifying the drinking water. The U.S. education system is very bad in comparison to many other countries. The aristocracy of labor, the strata of comfortable and prosperous working people that once held U.S. society together is being gradually eroded. Overall, the United States is rotting from within, just as Rosa Luxemburg predicted, while our government is stretched across the planet trying to maintain globalism, imperialism through constant wars. The NATO countries are in a similar situation. If the system of globalism/imperialism is not dismantled, we will only see more chaos and impoverishment. The life expectancy in the United States has been decreasing in recent years, and political turmoil and division have plagued society as well. All of this will increase if the current economic and political setup is not dramatically altered. The alternative world economy. In 1917, there was a revolution in Russia. A group of socialists who were considered to be a weird cult, a deviant offshoot of the socialist movement, took power. They were called the Bolsheviks, or the majority group. While the overwhelming majority of socialists in Europe had reversed their anti-war stance and supported the war, the Bolsheviks opposed World War I. They opposed it, saying that workers should turn their guns around and make war against the war makers. Their slogan was "Turn imperialist war into civil war." The Bolsheviks were viewed as being similar to a monastic order or priesthood. Their way of organizing was rooted in the Eastern and Asiatic aspects of Russian society. Much like the Old Believers or the Decembrists, the Bolsheviks organized a small group of dedicated people who gave the whole of their lives. They engaged in agitation to stir up the people to rebel, and they picked out the best and brightest among the population and gave them propaganda, teaching them their very complex set of beliefs based on Karl Marx's idea, but including Lenin's innovations about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and the need to support national liberation movements among colonized peoples. When Lenin returned to Russia in April of 1917, he instructed the Bolsheviks to stop calling themselves socialists and social democrats, but instead to call themselves communists, to show that they were a distinctly different movement from the various Marxists and labor leaders who sold out and supported the war. Lenin's work focused on exposing how the social imperialists and social traders were an effective mechanism for stabilizing the colonial system, not revolutionaries fighting against it. When the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, they immediately announced that they would support anyone who opposed the Western imperialist system. They sponsored the Congress of the People of the East in Baku, Azerbaijan. They funded the Emir of Afghanistan, a conservative traditionalist monarch, because he was fighting the British Empire. The new country they created, called the Soviet Union, defined itself as the leader of the global communist movement that sought to defeat imperialism. In 1928, Joseph Stalin emerged as the leader of the Soviet Union. He launched 5-year economic plans to turn Russia and the surrounding nations into modern industrial countries. During the 1930s, while the rest of the planet was experiencing the Great Depression with massive unemployment, the Soviet Union had an economic boom. With an economy that was 91% controlled by the government, the Soviet Union became an industrial powerhouse. They electrified the entire country, providing universal housing, full employment, and full education. They wiped out illiteracy, built a network of huge universities, and made dramatic breakthroughs in art. A woman named Tatiana Fedorova described the atmosphere when they built the subways in Moscow. We wanted to do something with our own hands to glorify our country, not just with words, but with deeds, and we did it. We built the metro. We built Magnitogorsk. We built the railway. We did it all with such comradeship, enthusiasm, and happiness. And if today I could live again, despite all the big difficulties, I would have done the same things again. Stalin set a task: build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and the enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. It was one of the most difficult times to build this country. To build these great construction sites would only be possible through unity. The unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. And for us, Stalin was our idol. The Soviet Union defeated the Nazis, invented space travel, and achieved very rapid and dramatic improvements in living standards. After the Second World War, it sponsored many other countries that had been under the domination of imperialism to do the same thing. In Africa, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere raised their people from poverty. In the Middle East, Arab socialism in Egypt, Ba'ath socialists in Iraq and Syria, and Islamic revolutions in Iran broke their people free from imperialism and began constructing. China had its 1949 revolution, with the Communist Party taking power and launching 5-year plans to construct. The aftermath of the Second World War is called the post-war economic expansion by economists. It was the greatest episode of growth in human history, with millions of people rising from poverty. In countries aligned with the Soviet Union, this was done with state central planning. In many countries aligned with the United States, This was often done with militarized control over the economy. In Europe, a huge welfare state was created, providing high wages, free health care, free college, guaranteed vacations, and other benefits. After the burst of post-war economic expansion, the global economy began to slow down during the 1970s. The Western countries started seeing unemployment and a value crisis, and all the same old problems rooted in production organized for profit. In the Soviet Union and the countries aligned with it, a serious problem existed when it came to consumer goods. State central planning is great for building power plants and universities, paving roads, extracting oil, etc. However, for clothing, children's toys, restaurants, and the things that make life fun and enjoyable, state central planning has certain big limitations. During the late 70s, China started to adjust its economy to use the market to complement their overall planned economy. This model, called socialism with Chinese characteristics, was very successful. The state issues 5-year plans and controls major industries, but within this overall planned economy, the market and human creativity flourish. Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping explained it this way: the fact that China is poor, has weak economic foundations, and is backward in education, science, and culture means that we have to go through a hard struggle. We want to make use of foreign funds and technology and to actively expand our foreign trade, but we must rely primarily on our own efforts. We are opposed to those absurd reactionary concepts of impoverished socialism, transition in poverty to a higher stage, and making revolution in poverty touted by Lin Bao and the Gang of Four. But we are also opposed to the idea of turning China into a so-called welfare state right now, because that's impossible. We can only improve our standard of living gradually on the basis of expanded production. It is wrong to expand production without raising the people's standard of living, but it is likewise wrong, in fact impossible, to raise the people's standard of living without expanded production. The Communist Party of China controls the economy, working to make sure living standards are constantly going up. As Deng explained, China always used to be described as a heap of loose sand, but when our party came to power and rallied the whole country around it, the disunity resulting from the partitioning of the country by various forces was brought to an end. So long as the party exercises correct leadership, it can rally not only its whole membership, but also the whole nation to accomplish any mighty undertaking. The Soviet Union needed to adjust to be more like China and utilize the market to strengthen its planned economy. However, it was unable to do so. Over the course of decades of invasions, blockades, sanctions, and infiltration, the Soviet Union had become too rigid. The Soviet Union could not bend, so it broke. In the 1990s, Russia's economy was a disaster, and Wall Street and London corporations looted them after the fall of the USSR. U.S. economist Andre Gunder Frank called it economic genocide. However, starting in 1999, Russia's economy began changing again. Putin put oil and gas under state ownership and used the oil revenue to rebuild the industries. He also provided support to many private businesses so they could flourish as part of an overall state plan for economic revival. By 2003, Russia's economy was growing again. Today, there is a whole section of the planet that is not under the control of globalism/imperialism. There is a whole network of independent economies. They all have a very strong government that emerged out of a revolution against globalism, imperialism. These governments control the economy with public ownership of banking and natural resources along with other commanding heights. They provide credit to business owners and innovators as part of an overall vision to ensure economic expansion. Some of these countries are led by Marxist-Leninist parties, but many are not. Even the communist governments like those in Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, and China do not seek to bring back the Soviet model. They practice a form of 21st century socialism that involves utilizing and subsidizing the market to ensure growth. Similar to what China has done with socialism with Chinese characteristics, or Vietnam's socialism-oriented market economy. Iran calls its economy not capitalism, but Islam, and resists its economy. The leaders of the Islamic Revolution strongly reject Marxism. However, the state controls the oil and the banking sector, along with major industries. The biggest economic entity in the country is a military organization called the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. A government that emerged from a revolution against a dictator appointed by the British Empire plans out the economy to ensure economic growth, empowering business owners, stimulating communities with credit, etc. In Latin America, the governments of Nicaragua and Venezuela practice Bolivarian socialism, rooted in indigenous traditions, Christianity, as well as Marxism. In Africa, many military governments have recently emerged that play a similar role. China has created the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as an economic bloc and provides loans to build roads, railways, etc. with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Russia has created the Eurasian Economic Union. In Latin America, there's a bank and alliance called the Bolivarian Alternative for Latin America. In the Middle East, Iran is aligned with Shia Muslims in Lebanon and Yemen, as well as other forces throughout the region that call themselves the Axis of Resistance. An economic alliance called BRICS has been created that seeks to create a new currency and empower various countries to develop free from the domination of Wall Street and London. What started with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 has evolved over the years into something new, exciting, and constantly changing. A new section of the world where the market is under the control of governments of action and the priority is growth is marching ahead. In China alone, 800 million people have been lifted from poverty. Russia has built the largest bridge in Europe, connecting Crimea to Kerch. Cuba has built what Ban Ki-moon called the world's greatest medical school. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is flourishing, bringing wealth and development into Central Asia. Russia's Far East is experiencing a farming boom, with the largest harvests in the world taking place. A big section of the planet is growing, with popular movements that understand it is their duty to build, construct, and stimulate human creativity. Degrowth and Malthusianism. However, in Western countries, profits are still in command. The monopolistic corporations, stretched across the planet in the globalist imperialist system, utilize the government to secure their position as society is becoming more and more unstable. Many of the ruling elite have come to the conclusion that the only way to stay at the top of the world is through destruction. The economic theories of Robert Thomas Malthus, who spoke of overpopulation, have long been popular with the ultra-rich. The big bankers and monopolies are openly talking about how they need to reduce the global population and dramatically degrow the world economy. The computer revolution is taking the problems of the capitalist economic system to new heights. Human labor is being replaced by artificial intelligence, and the new gig economy is completely changing what it means to be a working person. In Western countries, the ultra-rich are gathering at the World Economic Forum and discussing very sinister plans to keep themselves at the top of the world. They are discussing how you will own nothing and be happy about it, live in a pod, eat bugs, etc. They are dreaming up all kinds of schemes for grinding us all into poverty with economic controls, reducing the population, reducing consumption, and preparing for an all-out war against the new economy that is challenging the dominance of the Western system around the world. Meanwhile, there's a layer of wealthy people who disagree. Donald Trump in the United States, the AfD in Germany, and the National Front in France are made up of business owners who just want to make money. They aren't interested in a scheme to save the system, and they want deregulation so they can increase their profits. This is the basis for the big divisions in Western politics and the rising political turmoil. A government of action. The reason the New World is rising while the West is falling is rooted in the problems of production organized for profit. Technological advancement should not lead to poverty. People should not become poorer because of abundance. Ultimately, what is needed in the United States is a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a state that represents the interests of the majority against the globalist imperialist monopolies. This state will stimulate economic growth, fund small businesses, and create people to be strong, healthy, and creative. The Center for Political Innovation has a 4-point plan to rescue the U.S. economy. Number 1, a mass mobilization to rebuild the country. Now is the time to hire the millions of unemployed at union wages. Put them to work rebuilding the roads, bridges, water treatment facilities, power plants, schools, and hospitals of the country. High-speed railways must connect the Midwest and South to more prosperous regions. The universities must be revamped so that once again we are churning out the world's greatest scientists and engineers. A brain trust of the smartest minds must be assembled in order to lay out a detailed 5-year economic plan. The public must be mobilized to carry it out with the full support of the country's resources. Number 2, public ownership of natural resources. It has become clear that big corporations and banks are not trustworthy in their management of America's oil, natural gas, coal, timber, and other natural resources. As communities across the country fall into greater poverty, Wall Street monopolists enrich themselves from the natural wealth of American soil. Nationalization of these resources will end the budget deficit. The profits from America's wealth must go to the country overall, not into the pockets of a few bankers. Popular power will be far more capable of managing of these resources to ensure a better future. Number 3, public control of banking. Speculation, money created from money with no real added value, hangs as a curse over the U.S. economy. The Bible, the Torah, the Quran, and every major religion historically have forbidden the lending of money at interest because it creates an ultra-rich creditor class, bringing the problem of monopolistic stagnation, extreme centralization of wealth in the hands of a few. The lending of money should no longer be carried out for profit, but should be done by communities and the country overall at the local, state, and federal levels. In place of the financial sector, a national bank as well as many state and local banks should be created. Credit should be assigned in accordance with an overall economic plan, securing long-term growth and development. Interest should be paid back into the public budget, lifting the burden of taxation from working families. We need a debt jubilee to reboot our economy from the downward spiral hanging over it. The Federal Reserve rip-off scheme and all the other mechanisms through which bankers and monopolies have found ways to siphon off the public budget need to be gotten rid of. We need an economy based on the real value created by human labor power and creativity, not the various schemes invented to generate worthless paper for those who are already rich. Number 4, an economic Bill of Rights. In his final State of the Union address, President Franklin Roosevelt proposed an economic Bill of Rights. The right to a job, housing, education, and healthcare must be added to the U.S. Constitution. No one in the country should be left hungry while so much wealth exists. No one should be homeless in a country with millions of empty houses and apartments. All who can work should be hired to do useful work building a better America. Education should be considered a necessity for maintaining an informed population and a healthy country. We must invest in our population as a great resource for making a stronger country. Conclusion: the crisis facing the United States is rooted in the economic system. Great technological advances should mean more prosperity and abundance for all. However, we have an economic setup in which abundance and economic expansion lead to greater impoverishment, lower wages, inflation, and instability. Most of the politicians are not loyal to the country, but rather to an international financial system of big monopolies that extract super profits from across the planet. They are disconnected and unconcerned about the future of communities right here in America. The public is viewed by the ruling elite as an obnoxious horde to be controlled and managed. The United States and the rest of the world are being reduced to greater poverty in order to ensure that a clique of big bankers and international monopolies can stay at the top of a global high-tech economy. The danger of a new world war hangs over the USA as it threatens countries like China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. We, the Center for Political Innovation, reject this vision for degrowth, a 21st century dark age. Humanity must be unleashed to build a better future. This 4-point plan is intended to move the USA toward a rational planned economy in which human creativity and innovation are unleashed to greater levels than ever before. Wealth and abundance should be available for all, and every human being should be empowered to make the greatest contribution they are capable of. Those who feel a sense of responsibility, patriotism, and morality must take history into their hands. The time is now. We need a government of action to fight for working families. What is liberalism? Liberalism is the ideology that came out of the struggle to overturn feudalism in Western countries. It is a celebration of the individual and an opposition to collectivism. In Western politics, the so-called left emphasizes social liberalism, lack of community obligation, personal freedom, rejection of national identity, gender identity, religious or cultural identity, and breaking people down to atomized individuals. The so-called right economic liberalism, lack of central planning and economic controls, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, free markets, etc. Liberalism is good in some ways because it secured rights for individuals like free speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of conscience, etc., which did not exist before. The biggest deception of liberalism is that it separates individual rights from economic conditions. It makes freedom a purely moral question that exists in a vacuum and is divorced from the conditions of society. No one in the world spoke of freedom of religion or free speech until the 1400s in Europe, and this was not because people were simply immoral until that point. It was only with a certain level of economic development that such an expansion of freedom could be facilitated or even imagined. The political and social systems of humanity are tied in with the mode of production and the conditions of society. Most anti-imperialist countries do not have the same level of freedom we have in the Western countries. This is not because they are immoral, but because they exist in very different conditions. As living conditions become more stable and society becomes more prosperous, there is more freedom. The road to freedom is trade and development, and rational planning of the economy to secure abundance. Eventually, technology and development will create so much wealth and prosperity, and so little work will be necessary that total freedom will exist. The state and coercion will not be necessary, and social hierarchies will fade because, on the basis of abundance, they are not necessary. Human beings are collective creatures. Everything we have ever achieved has been the result of collective effort. No one in our time can point to anything and say, "I made this all by myself." Even a small craftsman or wood carver uses tools that are made in factories from the collective labor of others. Human society is always collective. Individuality and autonomy are good, and the more efficient production becomes in the context of a planned economy, the more freedom will exist. Liberal ideology that views human beings as inherently individualistic and sees any notion of group identity or ideology as totalitarian is very toxic. Philosophical irrationalism, postmodernism, and much of the new left thinking takes the rebellious and destructive side of Marxism and utilizes it to prop up the Western liberal order and its values, deconstructing any worldview that challenges it. The Soviet Union was demoralized by Khrushchev's secret speech, in which he attacked Stalin and preached against the notion of the cult of personality. He presented the idea that looking up to a leader and gaining strength from the spiritual power of this is something to be avoided. He was tapping into Oedipal feelings, the desire of a young man to murder his father. Oedipal feelings are an important part of adolescence, our natural impulse to assert autonomy from one's parents and define oneself as an individual. However, Oedipal impulses are balanced out by other drives within a healthy person. When imperialism globalism discovered how useful tapping into Oedipal feelings was in destroying movements and organizations, it cultivated a culture that pushes them nonstop. Western culture very much reduces young adults into being permanent teenagers, not taking responsibility, not having life goals and vision, and simply consuming passively and being manipulated with social media validation and passive entertainment. Often not even living on their own or having financial independence. Resisting liberalism means resisting the Oedipal liberal culture and finding joy in being part of a community, giving yourself to a higher cause, and accepting leadership. This often means acknowledging the existence of a higher power, learning to celebrate and worship great historical figures, and learning to trust the people you are struggling alongside, even when it's not easy. This is a spiritual and psychological journey every serious organizer against globalism imperialism must embark on. Building a revolutionary movement means actively combating your liberal mindset and impulses. What is living biologically? Liberalism views human beings as just another animal, not superior or unique in any way. Animals, like plants, are alive. However, they are not alive in the same way human beings are. They do not make big decisions. They do not wrangle with their purpose for existence. They simply exist, following their natural ability to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Time passes, and they flow along their preordained path, interacting with the economic ecosystem around them, but not making dramatic choices to alter it or impress their will upon it. They are not mastering their environment and changing the world around them for the better. They are not being creative, but merely drifting through time, existing. They are alive in the biological sense, but not the spiritual sense. This is how the liberal order of globalism, imperialism seeks for human beings to exist. They see us as little plants in a greenhouse, getting watered by them, bearing the fruits they expect of us, and getting composted when we pass away. When people join a revolutionary movement, they are making the decision to impress their will and human creativity onto the world. They are no longer simply living biologically, but are taking on a uniquely human existence, altering the world around them, engaging in activism to reinvent and change the world while wrangling with big questions. Our job as revolutionaries is to awaken people and get them to cease simply living biologically. With our educational work, we seek to get people to think, become aware of their own circumstances, and exercise their own will. Unfortunately, some people join the revolutionary movement and then succumb to the pressure and give up. They have resumed living biologically by giving up their agency and no longer taking up the challenge of history. This is tragic, but unavoidable. Staying on the revolutionary road is challenging and requires the support of dedicated comrades. Wrangling with these big concepts or attempting to struggle for change in isolation is an absolute recipe for failure. An organization is required. What is Atlanticism? Around the world, there's a rising school of analysis called geopolitics that analyzes how geography and land masses affect the rise of civilizations. The first work of geopolitics was a book called The Role of Sea Power in History by Alfred Maupin. He argued that the way to rule the world was to control trade routes of the ocean, and he analyzed the rise of the British Empire, the Roman Empire, and other civilizations. In Russia, geopolitical analyst Alexander Dugin divides the world between two major types of civilizations, Atlanticism and Eurasianism, or thalassocracy and teleurocracy. Atlanticism refers to sea-based empire, or thalassocracies, empires, and civilizations of the sea. The Roman Empire and the British Empire, along with the current international political and economic system centered around the NATO countries, give the primary examples of Atlanticism. These are militaristic societies that concentrate wealth in mighty cities and control global trade. They emphasize individualism and control through military domination. In opposition to Atlanticism and thalassocracy, there is Eurasianism, continentalism, or teleurocracy. These are empires and civilizations of the land. They tend to focus on connecting different cultures through trade and development, building roads, etc. They focus on shared economic interests and partnerships. Russia's Eurasian Economic Union and China's Belt and Road are modern examples of teleurocracy. If one reads about Ivan the Terrible, the various Chinese dynasties, etc., one can see a continuity. Alexander Dugin argues communism as a movement divided after the death of Lenin, with Stalin representing land socialism with his plan for socialism in one country, and Trotsky representing sea socialism with his theory of permanent revolution. The modern communists mostly hate Stalin and the existing Marxist-Leninist governments, but celebrate Trotsky, along with his vision of global chaos and bloodshed, as an Atlanticist deviation of the socialist movement, whereas Stalin and the various anti-imperialist governments that emerged since 1917 tend to be somewhat conservative and build socialism that emphasizes economic development and the shared destiny of people rather than vengeance, jealousy, and the desire to rebel and destroy. What is the Atlanticist pathology? In the first textbook of the Center for Political Innovation, Caleb Maupin spoke of the Atlanticist pathology. He noted that in 1888, a kind of murder that had never been seen before took place in Britain. The infamous Jack the Ripper, who hired prostitutes and then mutilated their bodies, shocked the world. What was equally shocking was that the London Times received thousands of letters from people falsely claiming to be Jack the Ripper, luridly describing details of murder. Jack the Ripper was the archetype of a kind of murderer that became common throughout the 20th century, the serial killer who derives sexual pleasure from violently murdering women. Serial killers were a direct result of cultural shifts that took place as Britain was emerging as an imperialist power. Parents were discouraged from showing affection to their children. Punishment was turned into a performative ritual. Sexual feelings became shamed and repressed in a much more intense way than ever before. All of this produced a form of violent, murderous insanity. It was not until the early 21st century and the rise of internet pornography that serial killers began to decline. They were replaced with mass shooters, another spawn of Western civilization, who became the primary form of murderous insanity. The Atlanticist pathology refers to a deviant mindset that arises from Western civilization. First, serial killers and later mass shooters both give expression to Western individualist and militaristic ideology. They celebrate violence and asserting their will over others through violence. They are usually insecure in their masculinity and feel a need to prove their strength, and they tend to be fixated on the libido, the internal drive that connects violence and sex. Serial killers and mass shooters are much like Western imperialists, seeking to prove their strength and assert dominance with explosive displays of destructive violence. The way the U.S. military destroyed Iraq in 2003 with shock and awe and murdered thousands of Iraqis is a similar in mindset and intent to the murders of Jack the Ripper or the many shootings at American high schools. It flows from an individualist, destructive mindset cultivated by the Atlanticist global order. Parental transference, the desire to embrace the love of a caring father or mother figure whom you can look up to, is the primary psychological balance to Oedipal and libidinal drives. Western society is busy inoculating people against parental transference, denying the existence of God, warning people about the dangers of cult of personality, etc., while emphasizing Oedipal and libidinal drives in a culture that celebrates violence, destruction, rebellion, vengeance, distrust, and individual self-gain. It is necessary for revolutionaries to look inward and battle the Atlanticist pathology within themselves. Everyone in the world, but most especially those living in Western countries, has absorbed a huge amount of the Atlanticist pathology. Constantly pushing back against your own Oedipal and libidinal drives, while allowing yourself to experience feelings of parental transference and love, is something revolutionaries must make a concerted effort to do if they wish to remain in the revolutionary movement and avoid succumbing to the insanity of the society around them. One way to do this is by having icons. It is important for revolutionaries to have photos or paintings of famous revolutionary leaders and people they look up to in their home. They should speak to these icons and imagine themselves having conversations with these figures in their minds. They should imagine these figures watching their activities, and they should strive to make these figures proud of their behavior. Another way of combating Atlanticism is listening to classical music each morning when you wake up and each night before you go to sleep. Classical music, unlike modern Western music, emphasizes conflicting and diverse patterns of notes as a form of intellectual stimulation rather than simply extreme emotions as is common in most contemporary music. Listening to Bach, Beethoven, or Mozart, or other music that is more structured and less blatantly passionate or explosive, is a way to reprogram one's mind. It is important to keep track of your dreams. Dreams reveal subconscious thoughts and feelings that may not show up in your conscious mind. If a revolutionary is not tracking their impulses and desires and simply goes with the flow, they will inevitably leave the movement and return to living biologically. In order to go outward and connect with others in the process of building a revolutionary movement, it is necessary to constantly look inward and become aware of the subconscious drives, impulses, fears, and anxieties that can impact our behavior and motivations. We are not communists. Many of the people who started the Center for Political Innovation originally called themselves communists. This made sense because of the emergence of the new economy against globalism/imperialism came from the Soviet Union and various anti-colonial struggles around the world, led by Marxist-Leninist parties. Our understanding of the political crisis largely draws from what Marx wrote about capitalism, and we celebrate the achievements of the countries that broke out of imperialism globalism in the 20th century. However, the Soviet economic model of almost complete state ownership is no longer in place anywhere in the world, and modern anti-imperialist countries understand the necessity of allowing the market sector to flourish as part of a planned economy. Many anti-imperialist countries around the world are not led by communists, but by nationalists, Christians, Muslims, or adherents of various other schools of thought that inspire them to fight globalism, imperialism, and empower their people to build and construct. Communism emerged in Europe in the aftermath of the revolutions that overthrew feudalism. Karl Marx and his contemporaries were disappointed that the French Revolution and various other revolts of the era did not create an egalitarian society. Marx studied economics and discovered many key aspects of how capitalism works, such as the value crisis, the falling rate of profit, surplus value, etc. However, Marxism, socialism, and communism were very much tainted by the politics of the era. The red flag was adopted because red is a color of blood, anger, and sexual passion. The French peasants had worn red caps during the revolution because of the emerging merchants, and capitalists wanted to unleash their passion and rage to tear apart the old society. Marx was an atheist, and communism as a movement embraced materialism, saying that spirituality and superstition were primitive and needed to be abolished. This made sense because, in feudal society, the kings and nobles claimed they ruled with God's authority, and people were forced to espouse specific beliefs or be burned at the stake. The fight to create modern science involved the struggle against brutal authoritarian institutions propped up by religion. The word revolution itself comes from Copernicus and his discovery that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but rather revolving. He risked being burnt at the stake for publishing his discoveries with his primitive telescope. The Bolshevik Party that Lenin created in Russia was certainly a Marxist organization, but it was considered a weird outlier and cult by most European Marxists. Lenin's theory of imperialism, his embrace of nationalism, and his vanguard party formation were all a shift away from what Marxists in Europe generally believed. When Lenin returned to Russia just before the Bolsheviks took power, he insisted that the Bolsheviks call themselves communists and not social democrats any longer, because they needed to show that they were a completely different movement from the reformist parties that had supported the First World War. While various anti-imperialist countries have planned economies and are building their people up in opposition to globalism imperialism, they have largely broken with the destructive spirit of rage and vengeance that flows from the classical Marxist-Leninist ideology. In China, it is universally understood that the Cultural Revolution was a disaster. In Cuba, many recognize that while Che Guevara was very heroic on the battlefield, his economic policies in the early years of the revolution were not successful as he tried to industrialize Cuba without providing material incentives. Pol Pot tried to create a purely communist society in Cambodia on the basis of an agrarian economy with his Year Zero campaign. All of these disasters were caused by the fact that these were impoverished, underdeveloped countries. When they had revolutions, they were locked out of the world economy. They then resorted to trying to build an egalitarian society without inequality in poverty. This was a huge mistake. The basis for eradicating inequality is abundance. Marx knew this. He explained that the higher stage of communism was only possible with vast abundance, when the irrationality of the capitalist market had been eliminated, and the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. The goal is not to redistribute wealth or make everyone equal. It is rather about unleashing human creativity with a government of action that stimulates economic growth and promotes creativity. However, in Western countries, communists do not believe this. Most communist groups in Western countries do not support the new alternative world economy. They condemn these countries as not real socialism. They repeat war propaganda against them. Furthermore, most communist groups in Western countries do not seek to create a planned economy. Some want to create profit-oriented worker cooperatives. Some want to deport all white people and return the United States to Native Americans. Some want to tax rich people to eliminate income inequality. Some want a government that will engage in a kind of progressive social engineering to destroy traditional gender roles and the family. The various visions of what socialism and communism mean to woke leftists and bizarre sects calling themselves communists are very diverse, but none of them seem to advocate what was once their basic goal: a centrally planned economy to eradicate scarcity and unleash productive forces. None of them have any understanding of what happened in the 20th century with the anti-colonial movements and the fall of the USSR. They are completely out of touch with the global anti-imperialist movement and countries like China, Russia, and Iran and Venezuela, and often they repeat imperialist propaganda against these countries, calling them fascists, and accusing those who stand in solidarity with them of being Nazis. Communist groups overwhelmingly reject Lenin's understanding of what globalism imperialism is and Marx's understanding of why we need a planned economy. Instead, they simply embrace the spirit of rebellion, rage, hate, and destruction that accompanies communist aesthetics. They are waging a culture war against the traditional family, religion, and many things that working people hold dear, rather than seeking to struggle against the system of globalism, imperialism, or putting forward an economic program to unleash growth. It is also important to note that Marx more or less designed his movement to be in line with labor unions. Labor unions are good and have won many victories for working people. But in the age of the gig economy, the struggle between factory workers and factory owners doesn't speak to what most people experience. An Uber driver rarely ever sees other Uber drivers and is often competing with them to get rides and maximize his daily revenue. Attempting to build a labor union adjacent independent movement of anti-imperialists was very successful during the 1930s. But in our time, it is a recipe for failure, rooted in an outdated understanding of the global economy and production. We are innovationists. We are in a new stage. Globalism imperialism is crashing and burning from within due to its own built-in problems and the new stage of destructive accumulation becoming dominant. Meanwhile, the anti-imperialist countries largely utilize central planning to build themselves up. The fight in our time is between growth and a celebration of human creativity and innovation, as opposed to degrowth, pessimism, Malthusianism, and all the negative emotions and destructive moves being fomented by the imperialists to save their system. In our time, the leftist aesthetic of jealousy, resentment, rage, and destruction is the property of imperialism globalism. They foment these emotions with social media, and around the world they destroy governments with color revolutions. Meanwhile, anti-imperialist governments tend to promote optimism, love, family, and community. Communist spaces in the United States are deeply unhealthy because communism has been associated with evil in American media and propaganda for so long. Communism tends to attract deviant people who want revenge, fantasize about becoming dictators, and generally have no way to relate to the bulk of the population. The many communist groups that exist tend to be centered around personalities who are jealous, competitive, and obsessed with their own image. They have little influence on the population and no real vision for building a mass movement. They simply want to create what CPI co-director Peter Coffin has described as a fandom. We are not communists. We are innovationists. We want to empower people to build, construct, and unleash the spark of godlike creativity within themselves. We want people to work together and build a movement against globalism and imperialism, learning their own skills in the process, and becoming healthier, more productive, wealthier, and happier in the process. Anyone who comes around the Center for Political Innovation can see we are nothing like the communists. We love our country. Many of us are religious. We aren't trying to make people hateful and angry, but to bring people together with kindness. We seek to build a community of solidarity and resistance. We give off the same vibe that the emerging anti-imperialist alternative world economy gives off. We celebrate humanity. We want to build people up, not tear them down. Innovationism is an optimistic movement and fits where the global struggle against the imperialist system is at in our time. The red flag of vengeance and rage is the past. Innovation celebrates love, human creativity, and strives for abundance. And our movement represents the future. We are the American incarnation of the Belt and Road, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Bolivarian Alternative for Latin America, the Axis of Resistance, and all the various movements emerging around the world that are pro-growth and pro-humanity. What is economism? In 1903, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin wrote a book called What is to be Done to lay out his vision for building a revolutionary organization. One of the trends he vehemently criticized in pre-revolutionary Russia was economism. These were Marxist activists who thought the way to be a revolutionary was simply to lend the economic trade union struggle a political character. They saw being a revolutionary as being a trade union secretary. Lenin made clear that his vision of a revolutionary organization was not simply a group of activists who aligned themselves with labor unions, but rather tribunes of the people who rallied all of society for revolution. Lenin wrote in his critique of economism is 1,000 times more relevant today as the economy has dramatically shifted. However, many communist groups, especially Trotskyites, but not just them, think the way to organize a revolutionary movement is to build a group of activists who support the labor unions. Kshama Sawant, the Trotskyite and former member of the Seattle City Council, has long sought to organize a kind of rent-a-mob for the AFL-CIO union bosses. Her hope is that this will empower the working class to break with the Democrats and form their own party. In reality, what she is doing is helping the union bosses leverage themselves in relation to the Democratic Party. The AFL-CIO bosses can say to the Democrats, "Look at the big protests we are capable of organizing. See how helpful we are? Now give us some of what we want." This is a failed strategy for a number of reasons, primarily because the labor movement in America, as it currently exists, is doomed. The overwhelming majority of labor union members in America are public employees. Beyond the public sector, very few workers are unionized. Those who are, steel workers, auto workers, are rapidly seeing their jobs eliminated by technology. The gig economy worker has a very different mindset than a factory worker. Gig economy workers compete with each other and have a very individualist approach. The idea that labor unions will have a resurgence in the way that they operate is an illusion. However, it fits the Marxist orthodoxy. Marx wrote of the struggle of the factory worker versus the factory boss. Activists stuck in communism are desperate to prove they are loyal to Marxist teachings. What is populism? Every anti-imperialist revolution that has ever been successful has been a revolution of all society against the imperialist. In Russia, the Bolsheviks built a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants on the slogans peace, land, and bread. Even the name Bolshevik meant majority group or majoritarians. When the Communist Party of China took over, when the Communist Party of China took power, it was on the basis of a block of four classes: the workers, peasants, urban merchants, and national capitalists, united around the economic and political program of New Democracy. Many millionaires and capitalists supported the Communist Party of China taking power. The Center for Political Innovation has an innovationist populist approach to organizing, rather than an economist one. We are not trying to organize factory workers against their employers. We are instead trying to build a movement of all society against the system of globalism imperialism and its push toward a new world war and a low-wage police state. We have no need to defensively claim we are still the real Marxists as we do it. We are innovationists, and innovationism is a new stage. Even in his time, Marx urged labor unions to not focus on their specific workplace, but to become organizer centers for the entire class. Innovationism goes further and says that rather than building labor unions, we need to build populist community organizations. We look to the Bolivarian circles of Venezuela, the Citizens' Power Councils of Nicaragua, the Basij Councils of Iran, the unemployed movements of the U.S. Communist Party during the Great Depression, the religious and community organizations that played an anti-imperialist role around the world. One great source of inspiration is the successful work of the Uhuru movement in Florida and Missouri among African Americans. Though they have a different political approach and understanding of race relations in the United States than we do, they have pioneered how to build community-serving organizations and a sustainable anti-imperialist base within the United States. The Center for Political Innovation has a complex vision for the next 5 years for establishing base areas of operations in various parts of the country and greatly expanding our influence and organizational capacity. We are not aiming to be king of the protest cage, as most communists do. We have no interest in the endless amount of competitiveness and ego contest among the fringe elements of U.S. society attracted to dissonant ideas. Our slogan has long been, out of the movement, to the masses. We seek to build a real, sustainable, long-term organization among the American people with deep roots. We seek to build a mass movement to demand a government of action that fights for working families. We seek to lay the basis for an anti-monopoly coalition to break the power of the big monopolies and create a new America beyond globalism imperialism. We have nothing against the labor unions, and we will support strikes and protests around economic demands, but we are not economists. We are populists and innovationists, fighting for all society. What does CPI do? The Center for Political Innovation is dedicated to building a real movement against globalism imperialism. Though we are a small group, we engage in massive amounts of activity both in the United States and around the world. When the Uhuru movement, a group of black activists, was raided by the FBI and charged with being foreign agents for supporting Russia, we did a huge amount to support them. We were considered their greatest allies. Meanwhile, the so-called communists did almost nothing while spreading rumors about them online. We understood that if they could come for the Uhuru movement for their activism, we could be next. It was urgent to defend free speech and the right to oppose globalism imperialism. These timelines of CPI activities from 2023 and 2024 will show how much our organization does. Compare our real activity to what some internet streamer who tears us down to feed their own ego has actually done. We are serious about opposing globalism, imperialism, and fighting for working families. 2023, February 19th. CPI co-sponsors the Rage Against the War Machine protests in Washington, D.C., where thousands gathered to oppose sending weapons to Ukraine and call for de-escalation with Russia and China. After the event, the CPI hosted a reception for protesters that was attended by nearly 200 people and gave a special platform to former UN weapons inspector and military analyst Scott Ritter. March 25th, 26th. The CPI convenes a two-day national gathering in Washington, D.C. to oppose Biden's Summit for Democracy. The event is titled Summit Against Hypocrisy and featured many prominent speakers and anti-imperialist voices. Peter Coffin created a documentary film about the event. March 29th. CPI members confront Taiwan leader Tsai Ing-wen outside her hotel in New York City, demanding she stop selling war in our country. June 23rd. CPI members hold a national retreat gathering and training school in Missouri. July 7th. CPI holds a forum called Money and American Injustice in New York City, exposing the criminal justice system and how it targets the poor. Peter Coffin created a film based on this event. December 2nd. CPI holds its first national convention in Portland, Oregon, centered on the coming end of imperialism and the need for America to accommodate the global shift toward Russia and China. It featured several international guest speakers, as well as prominent local anti-war activists. 2024, January 7th. CPI called a national day of action to oppose the bombing of Yemen. Protests were held in Portland, Humboldt, Chicago, and New York. January 26th. We published a book called Who Are the Houthis? What Are They Fighting For? This book provided the history of the Ansar Allah movement and its origins. February 15th. We convened an official press conference at the United Nations, announcing the American delegation to the World Youth Festival. At our press conference, we highlighted the Uhuru 3 case and expressed our concerns about facing similar retaliation for attending the international gathering in Russia. We took questions from the UN Press Corps, and the event created a splash in international media. February 29th to March 7th. CPI led the United States delegation to the World Youth Festival in Sochi, Russia. 3 members of our organization participated in the festival, and 2 of us spoke directly with Russian President Putin on the last day during a special session. Our remarks focused on how we could work to improve relations and integrate the United States into a new alternative economy emerging around the world as the Western imperialist financial system declines. March 15th and 17th. CPI members acted as official observers of the Russian presidential election, witnessing firsthand the massive public support for the government as the war in Ukraine continued and NATO imperialists maneuvered against them. April 26th to the 29th. 30 people attended a CPI workshop in Vermont titled Out of the Movement to the Masses. We published a new textbook for the gathering, reviewing the history of anti-imperialism and exploring how an effective anti-imperialist movement could be created in our time. May 26th. We were welcomed as guests at the Libertarian Party National Convention in Washington, D.C., where Donald Trump spoke. We distributed 1,000 copies of a new pamphlet, Do You Believe in Growth?, explaining our anti-imperialist perspective. June 7th. CPI co-sponsored an event on the peaceful reunification of Korea at Los Angeles Family Church. Over 100 people attended from diverse backgrounds, and the discussion focused on improving U.S.-DPRK relations. July 22nd. The CPI book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, published 4 years prior, was banned from Amazon for 7 days without explanation. The censorship occurred just as Kamala Harris became the Democratic Party's presumptive nominee. The sudden ban sparked outrage on social media, leading to an explosion of interest in the book. Over 3,000 copies were sold in the following days. August 19th to the 22nd. During the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, our team distributed over 1,000 copies of Kamala Harris and the Future of America and 1,000 copies of the CPI pamphlet, Do You Believe in Growth? We made our mark at the event, ensuring our perspective was heard by protesters, Democratic Party members, and others. September 3rd. CPI members attended the opening of the Uhuru 3 trial in federal court in Tampa, Florida. CPI addressed the press before the trial began alongside Joe Stein, Pam Africa, and New York State Assemblyman Charles Barron. September 28th. CPI co-sponsored the second Rage Against the War Machine rally in Washington, D.C., as we did with the first rally in February 2023. This anti-war gathering, organized by the Libertarian Party and the People's Party, was extremely important, and we were proud to support it. October 2nd, we launched the hashtag #PeaceMAGA campaign, kicking off at Trump Tower. For the final month of the election, CPI members unfurled a large banner of Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un shaking hands, along with the words, "Only peace can make America great again." We took to the streets of New York City, loudly promoting this message, highlighting hopes for peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and amplifying the best parts of Trump's message. October 12th, CPI held an all-day workshop in the Chicago area. The event was attended by 25 people and included strategic discussions for the fight ahead. October 27th, the CPI hashtag #PeaceMAGA operation attended Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden. We engaged with thousands of Trump supporters, sharing our anti-imperialist message. The banner was even noticed by The New Yorker, which highlighted CPI in its coverage. October 30th. CPI member Penny Arkos publicly confronted Congressman Ilhan Omar in Minnesota, shouting, "No money for rich men's wars." November 2nd. CPI participated in the Black is Back march to support the Uhuru 3 in Washington, D.C. November 23rd. CPI released a high-quality video letter to President-elect Donald Trump, urging him to become a peace president who stands up to the war makers and emerging low-wage police state. The video has been viewed by hundreds of thousands across various platforms. December 16th. CPI attended the sentencing hearing for the Uhuru 3 in Tampa, Florida's federal court. We were overjoyed that after being acquitted of the main charge of acting as foreign agents and convicting on a lesser charge of conspiracy, the Uhuru defendants did not receive any jail time or fines. They expect to overturn their conviction of appeal soon. 2025. January 20th. CPI members set up outside the inauguration celebration in Washington, D.C. with two huge banners, the hashtag #PeaceMAGA one, and another one calling to build a peace bridge connecting Russia and Alaska. 2,000 copies of our pamphlet, A New Day for America, A New Hope for a Peaceful World, were distributed to those attending the inauguration. February 22nd, CPI held a workshop in Minneapolis themed around Do You Believe in Growth? February 23rd, CPI members marched in downtown Minneapolis with the banner of Trump and Putin shaking hands that said, "We support peace talks and Ukraine war." What does it mean to join CPI? If you believe in human creativity, are opposed to globalism and imperialism, and want to join a community of people who will empower you to struggle for justice, you should join the Center for Political Innovation. We will put you to work doing outreach, spreading the message, and carrying out operations like the ones listed above. The times are very urgent, and the crisis is becoming more intense. Being a member means paying $15 per month in dues. Anyone can sign up on the website. Each Saturday, we have a general membership meeting online to update the organization on what's going on. In local regions, we have innovation circles of members in the area who carry out operations together. We are having our national convention in July in Chicago. We also have an accreditation process. After you have joined on the website, you will have the opportunity to sign up for our 7-day training program. This will help us to get to know you, ensure you understand our ideas, and teach the skills needed to be an organizer. Once you complete the 7-day program, you will be an accredited innovationist and receive a diploma as well as other honors. You will also be able to represent the organization in different ways. CPI is increasingly convening workshops around the country where we meet people and teach them about innovationism. We are perfecting the art of these workshops as a mechanism for connecting with people and building the organization. We are also engaging in constant demonstrations to show support for peace with the new economy that is emerging and oppose the danger of a new world war and the emerging low-wage police state. We often print small books and pamphlets in bulk to distribute at large events. Our members reach millions of people who would never go looking for this message, with an understanding of why globalism and imperialism must be opposed, the hope and optimism rising in the new world, and why we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need you to get involved. We hope you will connect with other people, find your voice spreading the truth, and overcome the isolation and atomization that is widespread in our times. The first step towards joining is signing up on the website. And that is that on the audiobook. The full reading of What is Innovationism? A Basic Introduction to the Center for Political Innovation by Caleb Maupin. Hopefully you got what you needed out of that one, and that'll be up. With that, have a good night.